Hi, my name is Michael William Denny. I'm the author of Path of the Thunder Wizard, Mounting Sleipnir, Thunder Shamanism, Shamanism for White People. I have numerous websites. Two of them are thunderwizard.com and thundershamanism.com. I want to continue this discussion on the origins of racism, specifically white supremacist racism. Understand that there are all kinds of racism. Anybody of any ethnic background who has any feelings of racial hatred or exclusion on any level is a racist. Sorry. I've run into racists of all different ethnicities. So let's just be clear about that. But let's talk about the racist policy that has had, or the brand of racism that has had the most impact on the world over the last few hundred years. And that is white supremacist racism. If you know anything about my work, you know that I work very hard to destroy any myth of white supremacy. I go into length destroying the whole Aryan myth. The Aryans were not in any way connected to Northern Europeans ethnically. And I share about that. The Nazis appropriated the term Aryan and applied it to Northern Europeans, and it's completely false. The Aryans never lived in Northern Europe. They might have lived somewhere in Eurasia and then migrated to India. A lot of native Indians will take umbrage at that, but regardless of whether they came from India or from Eurasia, they did not come from Northern Europe. I share about that at length in some of my other videos. The point I'm trying to make is I'm not a white supremacist, at least by my understanding, I'm not. And I want to talk to you about the origins of racism. In order to understand that, you have to understand history. We are not taught the history of Northern Europe. I talk about this at length in one of my other videos. I want to talk about one specific instance that had such a monumental shift and effect on all of the world up till the present moment that is rarely talked about. And if it is talked about, it's talked about out of context and in very incomplete terms. And I believe this has a lot to do with where white supremacist racism came from. And it is the internment of the Gothic tribes by the Roman Empire, which led to the fall of Rome. Northern Europeans and Romans, in prehistoric times and before the fall of Rome, were ethnically very different from each other. And I won't go into too much detail, but when the Romans were conquering Northern Europe, the Romans were ethnically shorter, dark-skinned, dark-eyed people, dark-haired people. And they viewed Northern Europeans, blonde hair, blue-eyed, white skin, red hair, they viewed those people as being racially inferior. And they were very different looking. They were physically larger, they were very different. So that's the background of that. And Northern Europeans, while the Romans were conquering them, suffered tremendously from racial profiling, however you want to call it. And this went on for hundreds of years. Here's where it all culminated. So this is the background. What had happened is that the Gothic peoples were migrating around Northern Europe. They may originally have been from Scandinavia, but they were roaming around Northern Europe, and they settled in a part of Europe that became invaded by, was it the Huns? Yeah, the Huns. The Huns were from East Asia, and they came in and they attacked Western Europe, and they colonized Western Europe for a short period of time. And they drove out the Goths. And so the Goths, being pursued by the Huns, they were trying to escape the Huns because they didn't know how to fight that kind of warfare. Europeans, tribal Europeans, they did some guerrilla warfare, but not to the extent that the Huns did. The Huns were experts at guerrilla warfare. And the traditional European way was to fight face to face, like white people do in bars. It's really typical. They stand and they yell at each other, and, okay, let's go, and they push each other, and then they fight. A lot of people don't do that. In other parts of the world, somebody says something and they throw a knife at them, or something like that. But that's your typical white person. They do that. They fight face to face. That was part of their code of honor. So they didn't know how to fight these Huns. So they were driven out of their territory, and they ended up on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. And so as they're massing, they're like backing up against the Roman Empire, and there are thousands and thousands of these Goths, or tribal Goths, are backing up against the Roman Empire. So they approach the Roman Empire and they ask to be let in as citizens. They want to take their Gothic society and integrate into Roman society. And the Romans didn't like that idea at first. I guess we can understand that. We deal with that. Other countries deal with that, where refugees come in, and it can be an issue. So I can understand that. So they say, well, okay, we'll let you in, but we're going to process you first. So they let them all into this enormous concentration camp, an internment camp, a processing camp. And the understanding that the Goths had was that the Romans were going to provide them with food and with clothing, and they were going to process them and bring them into the Roman Empire. And they were fully willing to do that. They were willing to integrate into the Roman Empire, and the men were willing to sign up and join the Roman army and all of that stuff. That's not how things went. What ended up happening is that the men of fighting age were indeed put into the Roman army, but they were put on the front lines, basically being used as human shields. And they were forced to fight many times their own ethnic cousins up in Northern Europe, and against the Huns and other people like that. And while they're off fighting and dying, as these human shields at the front of the Roman armies, their grandmothers and their wives and their children and their all these people are in these internment camps. And the Romans are supposed to be giving them food, and instead what they're doing is they're holding all of the supplies and they're making money off of it. And they're bartering with these people, and so a lot of people ended up having to go into slavery. And really sadly, it's noted very clearly that while this is going on, Gothic mothers and grandparents are selling their children into slavery just so they can get dog meat to eat. Makes me very sad when I think about that. And so what ends up happening is then, and there was actually we've heard of in American history, there's the Trail of Tears where Native Americans are forced to march for thousands of miles and people die on the road and all that. This happened to the Goths as well. They were forced to march for, very long distances and people died in the process. It's the same story. And it's happening under a different racial scenario where the Romans are are racially excluding white people, except this time white people are on the other end of it. So what ends up happening is the Goths, while all this is going on, the Gothic warriors, those who survive fighting in the front lines of the Roman Empire, become, as you can imagine, really badass fighters. These guys are the baddest fighters in all of the Roman Empire by this time. And the Romans didn't think this one through. So what do? They first start sending out appeals to Rome to, hey, you guys promised to give us all this stuff and you didn't give it. And that doesn't get anywhere. So these warriors are able to organize all of their people, and they pick up and they rebel and they break out of this prison and they go to the closest Roman armory, which has food and all kinds of stuff, and they camp outside of it and they say, we're here for the food that you promised us. And the Roman armory invites the chiefs in an attempt to kill them, and sets up this feast in their honor, and they betray them. And I don't remember the details, but it didn't work, and so the Goths storm the armory and get the supplies. Now they're still just trying to get into the Roman Empire. They're not trying to take down Rome. So what ends up happening is that Rome sends these legions against them to destroy them or quell them, and the Goths annihilate them. And so they keep moving. They move from one Roman town to another, all through the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, trying to get the supplies. And the whole time they're waiting for Rome to go, oh my gosh, yes, let's get you processed and get you as citizens of the Roman Empire. But the Roman elite respond, by trying to defeat them militarily. And what ends up happening is that their whole Roman Empire gets annihilated. So this is the background. And so the Goths camp out around Rome and they wait. During this time, and it goes for a long period of time, the Romans end up starving themselves out. They end up eating all the food that they have and all the supplies, and they eat all the animals and the pets that they have. And finally, some Roman opens up the gate because he's just tired of. And the Goths have been waiting for so long, and they storm into Rome for one purpose only, to get the supplies that has been promised them. And the supplies are all gone. So what do? They flip out and they sack Rome. But what's interesting is that by this time in their history, after 400 years of political, cultural, racial exclusion and oppression and slavery and all that kind of stuff, what do? They become Romans. So the Roman Empire from then on is of Germanic origin. The Spaniards, have you ever noticed Spanish names? Gutierrez, Dominguez, all of these Spanish names are actually of Germanic origin. Raúl, those are all German names. These Goths who took over Rome and took over Spain, they ended up adopting Roman culture and religion. And that's how Europe all became white. That's how it happened. But what does this have to do with racism, you're asking? Well, after 400 or 500 years of racial oppression by the Romans, the Germanic tribes had, by this time, absorbed a massive, deep racial self-hatred and feeling of racial inferiority. And so when they conquered Rome, by accident, they ended up adopting Roman everything. Roman culture, Roman language, Roman religion. And they completely discarded their Germanic heritage, their Germanic language and their Germanic religion. And they forgot that they were Germanic. These are the people who then began running the Holy Roman Empire. And so these same Germanic tribes people who had adopted the Roman culture and religion now went to reconquer their homeland and had seen their religious heritage as barbarian, as pagan, as heathen. The words pagan and heathen, by the way, are terms of derision, which is why I do not identify as a pagan or heathen. These are terms of derision against native, indigenous religious practices. They saw their own heritage as being evil and wrong, and they took the Roman racial and cultural and religious superiority mindset and overreacted to it and increased it. So what ended up happening is because they forgot that there was a race, that they were once racially oppressed peoples. They forgot that. They adopted this mindset of white people being superior. It's a Roman understanding, and the Romans were actually dark-skinned people. But they adopted the racist tendencies of it and made it fit because, you know, over hundreds of years they forget. And so they think of themselves. And to this day, we think of Greeks and Romans as being white people. They weren't. They were dark-skinned people. This is that same, we project our subconscious issues onto modern times. You know, that's why Jesus has blue eyes and blonde hair. Even though Jesus, in my opinion, never existed. If he did, he was an ethnic Jew in the Mediterranean region, and he would have had dark skin and dark curly hair and dark eyes. He was not. He would not have been. But that's where this comes from. So they reconquer Northern Europe with a ferocity, and they bring with them their racial and spiritual bigotry. And they destroy their own culture. And so Charlemagne was the tool used by the Holy Roman Empire to wipe out the indigenous, animist, polytheist beliefs of the indigenous Germanic tribes people. And he did an extremely good job of doing that. And there's a whole other thing, the Verdun Massacre. We'll talk about that another time. This is getting back to the question of modern white supremacism. This is where it comes from. So now you've got people, by the time Columbus discovers America, and by this time all of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, has completely forgotten its history and what has happened, and is running on this unconscious, subliminal understanding of racial self-hatred. And so they take it with them wherever they go. These are the first people, and these are the Spaniards, who also were Gothic tribes people who did the same thing in Spain as happened in Italy. Germanic tribes people who bring with them this intense, unconscious self-hatred, racial and spiritual self-hatred and shame. And they project it onto every culture that they meet. And so they replay what happened to their ancestors. They replay on the Native Americans and on the Africans and whomever else that they ran into exactly what happened to them and their ancestors. And they destroy their, the Native American religion. They take Africans as slaves and destroy their culture and their religion, and they force their language and their religion onto these slaves. Because that's what happened to their ancestors. And it has an unconscious connection. This is important. I want everybody to hear this. Native Americans, don't give up your ethnic and religious heritage. And I know a lot of Native American tribes have discarded their native language and their religion. That's what my ancestors did, and look what happened. Don't let that happen to you. We're replaying history. So if you see white people as soulless, you're right. That's why. Most white people have no remembrance, have no understanding, have no sense of who they are. Most Westerners of European descent have absolutely no idea who their ancestors were. And who were their ancestors? Who were the native Northern European people? They were people who, if you look at the Tacitus, when he writes about his impressions of the Germanic Tribes people, if you read what he writes about them and you take out the word German or Germanic, you replace it with anything you want, it sounds exactly the same as if we're talking about a new tribe, an undiscovered tribe in New Guinea or in the rainforests of South America. That's who our ancestors were. The Romans considered the Germanic tribes, who are now the racists who are running the world. The Romans considered them to be the most shamanic people they'd ever run into. These were people who didn't even worship idols, according to Tacitus. They didn't see the gods as being in human form. They saw the gods in nature. They worshipped in groves. They worshipped at waterfalls. They worshipped in forests. Let me tell you something else about your ancestors. The people who later became these white supremacist people, the people who now are destroying the environment because of this racial inferiority and self-hatred that they've adopted from their ancestors for hundreds and hundreds of years. In the Germanic tribes people's mind way back then, there were sacred forests where the gods dwelt and the spirits of the land dwelt. And in these sacred forests, you were not allowed to make a sound. When you either walked or when you were on horseback and you went through that part of the forest, you were as silent as possible, because you did not want to offend the nature spirits and you wanted them to give you permission to travel through there. Now, if you fell down while walking through there or fell off your horse, you were required to crawl the rest of the way out of that sacred forest, because it was a sign that the nature spirits had not given you permission. Now you compare that with the people who are now cutting down whole forests. And those, I am ashamed to say I'm ethnically related to those people. So, what are my options? I could do what the majority of people do and just sort of tune it out and kind of forget about it and don't take it seriously. I could become like many other people who decide to discard their ethnicity and appropriate an ethnic or religious or cultural framework of somebody else. I can understand why they do that. There's one other choice which hasn't been adopted very well, in my opinion, and that is to reintegrate your own indigenous, shamanic, polytheist cultural heritage. But in order to do that, you have to be educated. And sadly, maybe it's not so sad. I mean, everything has to go through its infancy. Neo-heathenism, in my opinion, is going through its infancy, and a lot of neo-heathens are, in my opinion, misled and mistaken because they don't understand who they really are. But that is one path, and that's what I'm trying to do. I have no ethnic agenda. I have no racial agenda. My main agenda is to do everything in my power to help Western society, who has become soulless, find their heritage so that we can come back as a species to our rightful indigenous heritages as people of the planet Earth. I don't care what happens to us racially. I don't care if we all interbreed and become one brown color. I could care less about that. But what I do care about is that we understand who we are. And all people of all races come from an indigenous shamanic background. It is, I think, necessary for white culture to understand who they came from. If the human race is destined to interbreed and become some new racial entity, fine. But in order for us to do that, we still have to know where we came from and who we are. We still have to access our DNA to connect to our ancestors. How you do that, I don't care. This is how I'm doing it. And if it's helpful for you, I invite you to join me. So you can learn about all this on all of my books and all of my writings and all of my DVDs, and you can go onto my website, thunderwizard.com or thundershamanism.com, and you can learn about all of that. So I've been encouraged to share my feelings and thoughts on video, so I'm doing it. Do with it what you will. Thank you for your time.